Hi everyone. So today we're going to go over the last technique for analyzing passages, which is the ICE technique. And this has been a really helpful method, and there's a few reasons that you can do it. The first is if you feel like you're really confused about what you're reading. Maybe you read something and you're like, I have no idea what I just read. I don't know what is going on in the passage. This will definitely help you. Another reason that you can do it is if you get lost as you read or you have poor retention. So you're not really remembering what are the points that the author's making, how are they building their argument, etc. So ICE is a method where really it's how you analyze a passage. And so I'll go over a really quick example of how you can do it, and we'll also explain a little bit about the thought process behind it. So the big thing with ICE is you're going to be looking at each of the sentences in a paragraph and categorizing them into three categories. So the first category is going to be an intro. So are they introducing a new idea? Is the author giving me a new claim or new information that I haven't learned before? The second category is going to be conclusion. So is this sentence summarizing things for me, kind of wrapping things up, or telling me why the things that I read are important? And the last category is example, evidence, or elaboration. So is the author giving me some kind of support to back up a claim that they made previously? And keep in mind that intro statements are usually just when the author throws new information at you, but doesn't really elaborate on it. So this is a really good way to keep track, especially for philosophy passages or ethics passages where they just throw a bunch of information at you and it can feel confusing. That should be a trigger to you to just take stock of those ideas and keep track of it. So, what exactly is this cake in the corner? It's basically an analogy about ice. So, the reason why we're looking at ice is because if your kind of comprehension and how you read a passage is like layers of a cake, the first layer is always your main ideas. So, what are the big ideas that the author's using to kind of set up the stage for us when we're reading the passage? The second layer is what kind of details does the author use to then support the ideas that they're presenting? Things like examples, evidence, maybe statements and facts, or even elaboration. And the last layer is what are your big conclusions? So, why is the stuff I'm reading important? How does it play a role in the passage, etc.? So, if you want, you can start off with ICE. The three categories are pretty simple and straightforward to use. You're not going to be writing these down as you read the passage. You're just going to read each sentence and say them out loud mentally. But for the sake of demonstration today, I'm going to write them down. Um, can you change up ICE? There's so many versions of ICE that students have come up with, and I'm going to write down a few examples on the side. So if you don't want to say, oh, this is an intro, you can just say new info. I have some students say new idea. I even have some students just say start. Like this is the first time we're learning about a topic, we're starting off with that. As for conclusions, some people just like to write wrap up. They may like to write summary, so they may write some. Um, and some people just like to keep note of it in terms of a onk. I had one student who kept saying that. Um, and there's probably a lot of other versions, but conclusion is pretty straightforward. In terms of example, evidence, or elaboration, people just usually like to keep track of it as example. Some people like to say discussion in their head. Elab is the most common one. So there's different ways that you can just like change up ICE, but the basic structure is they're giving you some new information or introducing something. There may be a conclusion in the paragraph, and there may be an example or something to back up a claim the author made. Now, keep in mind, ICE is a way to analyze the passage, and not every paragraph is going to follow the structure that we have with ICE. So, some paragraphs are really straightforward intro, example, conclusion, nice and simple. But some paragraphs are not like this. If it's philosophy, you may have a bunch of just intros of new information. Maybe if you're lucky in the second paragraph, they'll give you a bunch of examples. And at the end, you might have more new ideas and maybe a conclusion. So ICE, the function of it is to keep track of what you're reading. And if you keep track of what you're reading and categorize it, it's going to become less confusing because you're not going to be preoccupied with trying to interpret it or figure out what's going on. You're just linking different ideas that the author is giving you. So you're focusing primarily on the text itself. So now we're going to transition into a passage really quick. Okay, so I'm using this passage from Khan Academy called Puritan Society You can check out their cars passages. They're all free and they're very helpful. And we're going to walk through ICE for each paragraph. What's nice is this one has a lot of different sizes of paragraphs. So I'm going to walk through a few of them to show you how the structure can vary and how you can keep track of it with ICE. So again, we have ICE, we have intro, conclusion, and E, which is like example, evidence, or elaboration. And I'm also going to show you like different alternative ways that you can do ICE. So just in case you're like, okay, I don't want to use the acronym, you can still figure out how to analyze the passage. So we're going to go ahead and read the first paragraph. So a throng of bearded men in sad-colored garments and gray steeple-crowned hats intermixed with women was assembled in front of a wooden prison. So this looks like it's just setting the scene for us. It's giving us a visual of who's being involved and where these people are. So it's just an intro. So I would put maybe I'd put intro. You could even say new info. And so again, this is going to be done mentally. You just read it and you're like, okay, this is just setting the scene for me. So something you could even write is setting the scene. So when you're practicing it for the first time around, it's totally okay to like take a screenshot of the passage, maybe annotate it on your iPad or something. But ideally, you want to get in the habit of doing it mentally. I'm just writing it down for demonstration. So let's go ahead and read the next paragraph. So the founders of a new colony, whatever utopia of human virtue and happiness they might originally project, have invariably recognized it among their earliest practical necessities to allot a portion of the virgin soil at this site of a prison. Before this ugly edifice was a grass plot, much overgrown with burdock, pigweed, apple peru, and such unsightly vegetation, which evidently found something congenial in the soil that had so early borne the black flower of civilized society, a prison. But on one side of the portal was a wild rose bush, covered with its delicate gems, which might be imagined to offer their fragrance and fragile beauty to the prisoner as he went in, and to the condemned criminal as he came forth to his doom. So this is an interesting passage. It's very long and convoluted, so let's kind of break down what they're talking about. So it looks like in the first sentence, they're talking about the founders of the new colony, some kind of like utopia, or they were aiming for utopia or happiness. Actually realized that they had some practical things to think about when it came to building a society or in this colony. And so they took some of the new soil. They probably refer to virgin soil because it's a colony that they're setting up and it's a new colony. So they took some of that new soil that they had in their colony and they decided to build a prison. So this is kind of just an intro because it's just telling us that these people who founded the colony, who maybe are related to the men that we read about in the first paragraph, realized that they had to set up some kind of prison. It's a practical thing that they had to do. Then we go into talking about the prison. So it's a very ugly kind of building. It was overgrown with a bunch of different types of vegetation. And somehow it found something that allowed it to kind of bring forth this prison. So even though the building was really ugly and kind of the vegetation around it was not so great, you had this prison. So this is more of just an elaboration on the point that they made here. Because in this first sentence, they're talking about how they decided to make this prison because it was a practical thing. And then they kind of elaborate and just tell us what that prison looks like. It's kind of like an ugly building. It's not the most prettiest thing, but hey, we have this prison. And it said, even though it was very like unsightly or kind of ugly, on one side of the prison or the portal was a wild rose bush. So it had some kind of delicate gems, which we can imagine to be the flowers, and it had some fragrance and beauty. And that was offered to kind of the people that went in and the people that came out of the prison. So this is contrasting kind of like what they're talking about in this part right here. Because here they're saying the prison is ugly, but here they're saying, hey, it's actually, there's some beauty there in the rose bush. So we're going to just call this more elaboration. You can even say something like contrast if you want to keep track of relationships in the passage. So we have an intro where they talk about prison and the need to set up a prison in the new colony. They describe what the prison looks like, and it's kind of like ugly. So you can say elaboration, description. And then they contrast this kind of like ugly, sad kind of like description with something more pretty. So they start talking about the beauty of the rose bush near the prison. So elaboration, or you could even say contrast if it wants to be easier. So as you're reading, what I did was kind of pull from one of our other techniques that we covered called chunking, where I broke up the sentence, went through each part of it, and then decided what they were trying to convey once I hit the end of the sentence. So that's how you can kind of combine um, chunking plus like ice method. And so, yeah, this is that paragraph, and we'll go down to the next one in just a minute. Okay, so we moved on from this paragraph down over here, so we'll get started on that. This rose bush, by a strange chance, has been kept alive in history. It may serve to symbolize some sweet moral blossom that may be found along the track, or relieve the darkening close of a tale of human frailty and sorrow. So, we talked about this rose bush up here. We know that's like elaboration slash kind of contrasting the ugly prison building. And now they decide to talk a little bit more. So somehow this rose bush has been kept alive in history, meaning for some reason, even though the prison is so ugly and it's not the best area, this rose bush has like survived. So we could say either it's like an intro because we didn't really know much about the rose bush coming into it. Um, or you could say, hey, this is elaborating just on what they talked about from that previous paragraph. So you can look at it in both ways of connecting it back to what you read, or looking at it as just, hey, they're giving us some new information and just building on this idea of the rose bush. It may serve to symbolize some sweet moral blossom that may be found along the track, or relieve the darkening close of a tale of human frailty and sorrow. So they're kind of assigning a function to the rose bush. So why has it been here for so long? It could be something, a symbolic thing about moral blossoms, so maybe some moral lessons or things like that, or it's being used to relieve kind of like the darkness around the prison. So elaboration, you could even say it's a good example of how they use the rose bush. You can even think, hey, I think they're telling me the function of the rose bush and why it stayed around for so long. So again, we're just going through trying to figure out why the author is mentioning this information, which really helps because then it becomes less about getting confused about what you're reading and more about analyzing it critically. So let's look at the next paragraph over here. So the door of the jail being opened from within, there appeared, like a black shadow emerging into sunshine, the grim and grisly presence of the town beadle. He laid his right hand upon the shoulder of a young woman until, on the threshold of the prison door, she repelled him by an action marked with natural dignity and a force of character, and stepped into the open air as if by her own free will. Hester Pine bore in her arms an infant, who winked and turned aside its little face from the too vivid light of day. So now they're describing what's going on in this prison, and there's someone, a young woman, being involved. So at the door of the jail, so kind of like where the prison enters, being opened from within, so someone is kind of like opening it from inside the prison and coming out, there's a black shadow. So they're describing this person, the town beadle, as a black shadow. So they're just saying this guy's opening the door. So good intro, kind of setting the scene for us. And then the next sentence is him talking about this young woman. So he had his right hand and was kind of pushing out this young woman. And as he was pushing her out of the prison, she kind of like maybe pushed him aside or repelled him. And this was a important kind of like gesture because it showed her natural dignity and her character. It also showed that she had some kind of free will. So it's giving us a new character. So you could even say like, hey, this is some new info plus just some description of like what she's like. So maybe like intro plus example of this woman that we've never heard about. So new thing kind of going on here. And so they clarify what her name is. Her name is Hester Karn, and she has a baby. And baby's little, and it's kind of like turning its face away from the light. So just further description of what they're talking about with this woman. They're just describing her baby. So we talked about the prison in this paragraph. We talked about the rose bush kind of symbolizing hope or some kind of like relief from darkness. And then we have this young woman who's introduced who's coming out of the prison with a baby in her arms. So that's how, when you're reading it, you can figure out what is going on with each sentence. It's also helpful to do ice. You can either do it as you're reading it, or you can do it after you read the paragraph and you quickly scan it and you're like, okay, this is what's going on along the way. So we'll move on to the next ones. Okay, so we've gone over the baby paragraph, and now we're going to talk about this paragraph right here. So when the young woman, the mother of this child, stood fully revealed before the crowd, it seemed to be her first impulse to clasp the infant closely to her bosom, not so much by an impulse of motherly affection as that she might thereby conceal a certain token which was wrought or fastened onto her dress. In moment, however, wisely judging that one token of her shame would be poorly served to hide another, she took the baby on her arm, and with a burning blush and yet haughty smile, and a glance that would not be abashed, looked around her townspeople and neighbors. So I'm going to stop there because I don't want to go too far and kind of get lost in it. So they're describing this woman a little bit more. She kind of clasped the infant to her bosom, and it seems like she was doing it not because of motherly affection, but because she might be trying to cover something up that's tagged onto her dress or like fastened onto her dress. So she's hiding something. So this is more of just like a little bit more, if you're thinking about it from the previous paragraph, you may say, okay, this is elaboration. But I would argue that we could put in just new info, because we never learned about this thing about a token that's stuck on her dress and kind of why she's behaving the way she's behaving. And so in the moment, she kind of judged, okay, like I shouldn't kind of hide this token with my baby, another possible token of shame. So she took the baby with her arms. She was blushing, but she was still smiling, and she was not abashed, so she was not afraid to kind of look upon the people in her town. So kind of elaborating on her character and her behavior. So then it says, on the breast of her gown, so I'm reading here, on the breast of her gown in fine red cloth, surrounded with an elaborate embroidery and fantastic flourishes of golden thread, appeared the letter A. It was so artistically done, and with so much fertility and gorgeous luxuriance of fancy, and which was of a splendor in accordance with the taste of the age, but greatly beyond what was allowed by the sumptuary regulations of the colony. So something scandalous going on. We knew from above that there's some kind of token that she's trying to hide, but we don't know what that is. So here they're telling us what it is. This elaborate embroidery of the letter A on her dress. So this, we could probably say, is just an example of the token that they talked about earlier. And then they kind of describe it. It was artistically done and it was really pretty. However, it was kind of beyond like how they lived in the colony. So sumptuary regulations means that these people in the colony probably lived very simply. And her dress was, the A was a lot more elaborate than they thought. So kind of like an elaboration, but also a good conclusion, because it's telling us more about the colony. The colony people were probably not super fancy. They were not looking at elaborate embroidery and all that stuff. Yet here was a woman with that stuff on her clothes. So let's go ahead to the next paragraph, which is the last one. The young woman was tall, with a figure of perfect elegance on a large scale. So this is more of just new info or intro. You could argue, hey, this is building on how they described her before, but this is a new characteristic. So it's kind of just describing more about why she's elegant or pretty in accordance with the A on her dress. Those who had before known her and expected to behold her dimmed and obscured by a disastrous cloud were astonished to perceive how her beauty shone out, and made a halo of the misfortune and ignominy in which she was enveloped. So this is kind of showing of the perspective of people who had known her. They were expecting her to be kind of like sad, behold her dimmed and obscured. So there was some kind of really bad event that happened to her, probably either the child that she has or she was going to prison. But they were astonished or surprised to see that she was perfectly fine. Her beauty shone out, and she seemed to be okay, even though that the circumstances around her kind of like the misfortune that she was experiencing didn't seem to affect her. So outwardly, she seemed totally okay. So good elaboration. You could even say new perspective, because now we're learning about what the people around her think of her. But the point which drew all eyes, so that both men and women who had been familiarly acquainted with Hester Pine were now impressed as if they beheld her for the first time, was a scarlet letter, so fantastically embroidered and illuminated upon her bosom. So this is saying what actually drew people's attention was that letter A. So I'll just draw a letter A. So that's a scarlet letter on her dress. So even though people knew her, they were familiarly acquainted, what really impressed them was this scarlet letter, this letter A that was so beautifully embroidered on her dress. So kind of like new info, because now we understand, okay, they're showing this perspective of the people around her, and what they're actually really surprised about is the scarlet letter. It still does build on things we talked about previously, because it shows that, hey, this is the letter A that we read about previously, and now we're thinking about it in the context of the people in her town. It had the effect of a spell, taking her out of the ordinary relations with humanity and enclosing her in a sphere by herself. Good conclusion. You could even argue that this is a conclusion, but I'll keep it as new info because we're kind of just learning, like, okay, this is all tying things together. There's this new point that they're making, that there's a scarlet letter. And yeah, so we have kind of this conclusion that says there was some kind of like aura around her because of the scarlet letter, and kind of how it allowed her to change how she carried herself. So what I'll actually do is I'll change this to conclusion, just because it is a really good way of drawing in all the different perspectives. So it's drawing in the perspectives of her neighbors. It's showing us this connection back to that letter A that we were talking about. So these two are probably just conclusions, because it's showing how the neighbors and that scarlet letter relate to one another and their perspective, and also how it kind of changes how Esther looks. So the ice method, again, is really flexible. We did it with the ice and also an alternative way. And it's a very helpful way to say, okay, how's the stuff that I read previously connected to what I'm reading in this paragraph? And then how is the author kind of building their argument? And so that helps us see how they go step by step to explain that this person, Hester Pine, is someone who carries himself in a very beautiful way. It's in contrast with the kind of gloomy environment around the prison. And on top of that, it's mostly because of the scarlet letter that's on her dress that's kind of building this aura around her, but also drawing the attention of her neighbors. So I hope this was helpful. In the comments, go ahead and drop your feedback. And yeah, thanks for watching.